this horrific story was unfolding as we covered it in real time on Fox News, trying to get details into what was taking place, who was killed and who was wounded. And we're starting to get more information on the victims of this terrorist attack. The youngest is a 10-year-old girl, and the oldest is a Holocaust survivor. And this just gives you a sense of how indiscriminate these terrorists were when they were firing into this crowd who had gathered there at Bondi Beach in Sydney, Australia, for the first night of Hanukkah, where they were going to light menorahs and dance and sing and eat donuts, the traditional thing that Jews around the world do. And these people were slaughtered. And so police are now investigating exactly what happened, trying to gather more details to determine if this was an isolated incident. And you have Israeli officials who are expressing significant frustration with Australian authorities, saying they provided details into possible links to terrorism for individuals on the ground in Australia that could commit attacks against Jews. And ultimately, Israeli officials say these pieces of information were not taken seriously. And so we continue to follow what's taking place on the ground in Australia, but also across the region. We're also looking at a number of different stories across the Middle East. Over the weekend, we know that 2 American soldiers were killed by a lone ISIS gunman in Syria. And also, we know that there was an individual who's an American citizen who was acting as a translator and also killed, along with a number of people who were wounded in this ISIS attack. And so once we talk a little bit about this and the broader situation in the Middle East, I'm going to look to Facebook and to Instagram and take some of your questions that you have about not only the terrorist attack in Australia, but also what's happening around the world. As it relates to this story out of Syria, we know that these 2 American soldiers, along with this civilian interpreter, were killed by a lone ISIS gunman. And this is some information that we haven't yet reported on Fox because we've been so focused on the terrorist attack in Sydney, Australia. My team and I continue to gather information on all of these stories. But yesterday, I had an opportunity to speak with a senior Syrian official. And for the first time, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I was told regarding that shooting. There was a joint situation between local Syrian forces and the Americans on the ground, a patrol, actually an anti-ISIS patrol. And there was a senior leadership engagement, which is a normal key of events that would normally take place on the ground when American forces are in a place like Syria. And we know there are about 1,000 of them that are currently there, and they are helping in the coalition to fight the Islamic State because there still are these ISIS offshoots. What I learned from this senior Syrian official is that ultimately when they entered into this secured area, there was a lone gunman on the outskirts who was working with Syrian security forces, and he, using an AK, opened fire on these American forces, who engaged the gunman, killing him along with partner forces there. But unfortunately, 2 U.S. soldiers, along with a civilian interpreter, were killed. This gives you a sense of how dangerous it is for American forces who continue to try and defeat the Islamic State in places like Syria. And there are still some American forces in Iraq as well. And then finally, I want to touch on one other story that we are covering, and then I'll go to your questions, looking specifically here on Instagram. But that has to do with the broader Middle East ceasefire that was brokered by President Trump. He was able to get together a ceasefire to end the 2-year war between Israel and Hamas that began on the morning of October 7th. Of course, my team and I were here in Israel on that morning covering the story in southern Israel as that massacre was unfolding. And we then covered the war that took place. Ultimately, President Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, flew to Egypt, and they met with regional negotiators from Qatar and from Egypt, and they were able to broker a ceasefire agreement. Now, that ceasefire is broadly holding. There are some strikes that take place, some violations of the yellow line that divides Israeli control of Gaza and Hamas control of Gaza, but with just one body of a hostage being held inside the Gaza Strip, very quickly, the Americans and the Israelis, the Egyptians and the Qataris are working to usher in phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement. And that's what's taking place right now as we speak. They're trying to determine what comes next in all of this. And so when we look at what comes next, we have to basically see how this is going to unfold and try to understand what's taking place on the ground, not only inside Gaza, but also with a lot of the negotiations that are taking place. I'm going to answer a few of your questions here, and my producer is actually going to get the questions, and she's going to give them to me, and then I'll answer the questions. I can't see them here on the screen, but I'll be able to answer some of your questions that you may have about the terrorist attack in Australia, and then also some of the questions that you may have regarding the ceasefire in the Middle East, and of course the situation on the ground in Syria. Now, Syria is a place that my team and I have reported. We were there after the fall of the Assad regime in December of last year. Just days after the regime fell, we entered from Turkey and then ultimately drove to Damascus. And we've been following the situation on the ground there ever since. And there is a concerted effort by not only the new Syrian government, but also the United States and the Trump administration to try and find a way to normalize ties between the new Syrian government and regional countries like Israel. And now that's not going to be an easy task, and certainly there are challenges ahead. But when we look at the situation on the ground, we are able to try to determine exactly how things are going. And right now, despite this tragic incident over the weekend where American forces were killed on this anti-ISIS patrol, there is hope in the region for the first time in many years that there could be more normalization deals between countries like Syria and Israel, or Israel and other countries across the region, looking at places like Saudi Arabia. And so we do anticipate getting some questions here from you about what's taking place in the Middle East, and questions you may have about our coverage at Fox News. Of course, I would encourage you to tune into Fox and to follow all of our social media platforms, because we continue to follow the latest developments, not only here on the ground in Israel, but across the Middle East, whether it be in places like Afghanistan or Iraq and Syria, inside the Gaza Strip, in Lebanon. These are all places that we've traveled to bring you the news, to try and determine what information we can gather on a real-time basis. And then, of course, we're also covering other regional stories, like the situation on the ground in Ukraine, where we do know this week there are negotiators who are trying to basically get together some sort of agreement that could end the war there. So a lot of moving parts here in all of this. One of the questions that we have here has to do with the police response on the ground in Sydney, Australia. Someone asked where the police were at the time of the shooting in Sydney. And this is a very important question, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we know regarding this shooting that took place on Sunday. Again, to give you a little bit of the background here, hundreds of Jews had gathered to mark the first night of Hanukkah at Sydney's famous Bondi Beach. And there was some level of security presence, we understand. I saw an interview today from an eyewitness who actually was wounded during the attack. And he said there were brave police officers that engaged the gunman. Now, some reports indicate it took 10 minutes to take these gunmen down, and that's part of the reason that you saw these civilians trying to engage with them and do what